My name is Jessica Turton and I am an accredited practicing dietitian based in Sydney. I'm also doing a PhD investigating low carbohydrate diets for diabetes management. And when I'm not researching, I am consulting with clients all over Australia via Ellipse Health, which is my online clinic. And I really hold a lot of value in personalised nutrition. So even though today we're going to be talking about low carb diets and getting started with low carb, there's a lot of personalisation to it as well. I'm really excited about giving this talk because I do think that low carb diets are a tool that everyone should have in their health toolboxes. So we're going to be talking about what are carbohydrates, what is low carb, what's the definition of a low carb diet, different types of low carb diets, and we're going to build a low carb meal together. So starting with some Nutrition 101, carbohydrates are one of 4 macronutrients. We also have protein, fat, and alcohol. So we use macronutrients for energy, so we can run our body on each of these macronutrients. But just because we can run our body on these macronutrients doesn't necessarily mean we should. So running your body on alcohol, for example, is probably not a great idea to do all of the time. And then running your body on protein is extremely metabolically taxing. So protein is essential for our muscles and healing, our connective tissue, our bone density, our hormones, and much more. And we only really want to use protein for energy in times of starvation. So it's not an ideal fuel source. So that really leaves us with carbohydrate and fat. So which fuel will we choose? There are pros and cons to both, but if you want to run your body on glucose, by all means, you can put carbohydrate, so starch and sugars, in your tank. And then if you want to run your body on fat, we need to lower the carbohydrate and put fats in our fuel tank. So just like when you fill your car up with petrol at the petrol station, you want to put the fuel in your body that you want to burn. So because we need insulin sensitivity to efficiently metabolize carbohydrates, issues like insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia can also be looked at as a type of carbohydrate intolerance. So these are the people that often feel lethargic and tired a few hours after eating, and can even experience excessive hunger and irritability between meals. These are also the people that tend to experience weight gain around the midsection and even high blood sugar levels as well. And these are the people that tend to experience inflammation, so pain, digestive upset, those types of things. But these people have a choice. We can teach the body to run on fat, and we aren't dependent on insulin sensitivity when we run our body on fat. And people experiencing these types of things can feel a whole lot better. So there are many reasons we would choose fat for fuel, and you're going to learn about so many of them today. So from weight loss to improved blood pressure, better energy levels, there's so many things that running on fat can help your body with, particularly if you have insulin resistance or high insulin levels. But for now, we're just going to start from the very, very beginning, and we're going to talk about what carbohydrates actually are. Because if you're going to lower your carbohydrates, you do need to know where they are in your own diet. So have a think about what you ate yesterday. What did you have for breakfast, lunch, dinner? Can you identify the sources of carbohydrate in your own diet? So that's step number 1. Carbohydrates are everywhere. Long story short, they're in everything. So they include starch and sugars. Now, this is the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. You may or may not have seen it before. And these are our core food groups. So if you look at the orange section, that's our breads and cereals food group. So these tend to be the most well-known for containing carbohydrate. And that's because the foods in this group are very carbohydrate dense. So this is a large part of Australians' diets. If you look at the green section, that's our vegetables. So starchy vegetables like potato, corn, taro, and yam contain a lot more carbohydrate than our non-starchy vegetables, but vegetables are still carbohydrates. And then if you look at the fruits, which is the light green section, these contain a type of carbohydrate called fructose. And then the dairy, which is the purple section, contain a type of carbohydrate called lactose. And then in this group, we also have dairy alternatives like rice milk, soy milk, oat milk, that type of thing, and they all have carbohydrate as well. And then in the blue group, that's our protein foods. So these are less likely to have carbohydrate, so our fish, meat, beef, eggs, those types of things. But in this group, we also have vegetarian sources of protein, which do tend to be higher in carbohydrate, so legumes, tofu, nuts, and seeds. So carbohydrates really are everywhere. And this can be really daunting for someone who wants to go on a low carbohydrate diet, because it feels like everything's going to get cut out of their diet. But a low carbohydrate diet doesn't mean a no carbohydrate diet. So let's look at how this type of diet will compare to a low carbohydrate diet. So hopefully you can see the distinguishedness between colours, but it's a bit hard. On the left side, we have the high carb diet, so it's 45 to 65% energy from carbohydrate. So that's the diet we just looked at. The majority of the food intake is from carbohydrate. If you look at this one over here, it might be a little bit clearer, but you can just look between them both. And then the moderate carb diet is 26 to 45% energy from carbohydrate, and that's more of a balanced diet. And it can falsely be called a low carb diet, but it's not really accepted as a low carb diet, particularly by people in this community. The most accepted definition for a true low carbohydrate diet is what we can see on the right, which is anything less than 26% energy from carbohydrate. So 0 to 26% energy. So that includes a lot of different types of diets. Even within the low carb diet definition, we still have so many different ways we can make up a low carbohydrate diet. So you might have heard of the paleo low carb diet, an autoimmune low carb diet, ketogenic low carb diet, carnivore diet, zero carb diet. There's so many different diets out there that you can create within this classification. So where do we start? We have this colourful Australian Guide to Healthy Eating to help people formulate a high carbohydrate diet. But who's helping us formulate our low carbohydrate diets? Particularly when a lot of health professionals aren't even trained in formulating low carb diets. So this is the first project of my PhD, and it's a paper I worked on with a few other people, one of them being in this room, Rowena Field. Rowena and I looked through over 15,000 studies to find 41 low carb diet studies that were looking at the effect of the diet on type 2 diabetes management. So the reason we chose type 2 diabetes is because this is a clinical population where we have the evidence to show us it's effective. So we already know that low carb diets are the most effective diet for type 2 diabetes management. But for some reason, if you have type 2 diabetes and you go to your doctor or your dietitian, you're probably not going to get given a low carb diet or even offered it as a choice. And that's extremely frustrating. So the purpose of this paper was to push the science into practice. And we did that by focusing on the methods of the low carb diets to try and highlight the different types of low carb diets, and then develop a set of core principles to help practitioners and even the individual formulate their own low carb diets. So it is orientated around type 2 diabetes, but really anyone can use these principles. One of our major findings was that there is a huge variety of different low-carb diets. So within that classification, we did confirm we found a whole lot of different ways of creating low-carb diets. And what I'll share with you today is some of our discussion points. So I'm going to be talking about the results of this paper at the next conference in October, but I do want to share some of the practical considerations. So using the results of what we found from these 41 papers, we determined 3 core considerations for designing a low-carb diet. And the first one is carbohydrate amount. So we do really need to figure out how low we're going to go. The second one is the types of foods to include. So are you going to have just whole foods, a mixture of whole foods and packaged foods? Because you can still have a low-carb diet without whole foods. So which one is better? What should we choose? And then the mode of delivery is extremely important as well, because you don't just want to hand out a food list or a diet plan and then just tell someone, go off and do this, see you later. We need to follow up. The mode of delivery is very important. So let's focus on the carbohydrate amount to start with. How low should we go? Now, if you're just including these foods in your low-carb diet, so cheese, olive oil, coconut oil, butter, meat, fish, eggs, these foods don't have really any carbohydrate, or they have negligible carbohydrate. So if you were just eating these foods, you'd be looking at a carb intake of 10 grams a day or less. But if that doesn't seem like enough variety for you, you could add in some non-starchy vegetables like our green veggies and cauliflower and cabbage. And you could even add in some low-sugar fruits like avocado. You might even have a little bit of plain yogurt. And you could include these foods as well as the other foods, and you're looking at a carb intake of around 25 grams a day or less. But what about roast dinners? What about roast pumpkin, roast carrot? What if we want to have berries and cream for dessert? Well, you can include these orange and red foods and even nuts and other things like that in your low-carb diet, and you can still stay very, very low in carbohydrates. So you can include all of the foods we've seen so far and still remain within a carb intake of around 20 to 50 grams per day. And then there's these foods. So you can create a more flexible low-carb diet that still fits in with that classification for a true low-carb diet. And this is where some people do like to start. So instead of going all or nothing, there are some of having really bitter 90% dark chocolate, they may want to start with 70% dark chocolate. Or they may want to include just a little bit of rice cake or something like that. And it's certainly possible. It doesn't work for everyone, but it's certainly an option to consider. And then once you choose a place to start, you don't have to necessarily stay there. So we found that a lot of the carbohydrate or the low-carb diet interventions were fixed, so they stayed at one amount of carbohydrate the whole time, whereas many were adaptive, which means they started low, but then they changed according to participants' progress and just the duration of the intervention. And I find in my own clinical practice that adaptive carbohydrate prescriptions work really, really well. And that's because people are usually very motivated at the beginning, and a lot of people are kind of all or nothing, like they just want to jump into it and see results. And that's fine. So I help people start low until they see results, whether it be improved blood sugar control or weight loss or less pain, whatever it is. And then from there, we can tweak the carbohydrate amount. So we can go up or down depending on what that individual wants. And it really doesn't matter what your carb intake is, as long as you are tracking forward towards your health goals. So if this is something you want to do, I would think about what your health goals are and then think about the outcomes you're going to use to track the success of the dietary intervention. So then you know whether or not your carbs are too high, too low, or whether there's something else you need to think about to see success. Okay, so the second core consideration is the types of foods to include. So you've probably all seen the protein bars and the protein shakes down the supermarket aisle, and you might have even tried them before to lose weight or for whatever reason it is. And there's probably a lot of reasons as to why a whole foods diet is more optimal for all dietary approaches, whether you're low carb or not. But just because something is optimal, it doesn't mean you have to do it to see success. And a lot of my clients like to use protein bars or protein shakes on occasion to make one meal of the day just really easy and straightforward, and you don't have to think about it. And that's totally fine. We just look at the ingredients list and try to find products that have the least amount of nasty stuff and the most amount of good stuff. And then we have these wonderful food companies who are listening to us and seeing that there is a demand for low carbohydrate food products in the food supply. And for some people, these low carb goodies are really, really helpful. And for some people, they wouldn't be able to lower their carbs if they didn't have alternatives to their favorite foods. And that's fine. I think it's absolutely great that we have these foods available. But for some people, they can have reactions to foods like this because they may have really sensitive guts, or it may be the sweet taste that causes them to feel hunger and cravings, and then they can't successfully lower their carb intake. So again, we have to find what works for the individual. And then the third consideration is the mode of delivery. So as I said, we can't just hand out a food list and expect someone to do this successfully. We have to think about different things. So the support, are we going to get a dietitian involved, a doctor, a health coach, whatever it is? Frequency of contact, and then the use of remote contact as well. So remote versus in-person. I find remote contact works really well because it means I can connect with people all over Australia, wherever they are, wherever I am, and really help people and meet them where they are. Has anyone here heard of the Verta Health study? Yeah. It was a study conducted in people with type 2 diabetes in the US, and they used a low carbohydrate diet and found a 60% reversal of type 2 diabetes after 1 year. So that was pretty significant. But it wasn't as if they had a special low-carb diet. I think it was their mode of delivery that really helped them achieve success. Because they offered clients, they could choose whether they wanted remote contact or whether they wanted to see the doctors and the dietitians and the health coaches in person. So they had a choice. And they could also use a mixture of both. So these guys developed a mobile application. People could log on, put in their questions, put in what they've eaten, upload food pictures, and they had a really nice sense of community, and there was a lot of things they could track, and they got pretty instant feedback as well from the team. So let's go on to something a little bit more practical now. Building a low-carb meal. How can we put this all together? And I'm going to give you some really, really basic principles for structuring a low carbohydrate meal that doesn't really involve counting, weighing, or tracking. So it's a great place to get started. So step number 1 is to pick a protein. A lot of people forget about prioritizing protein. We are solely focused on reducing carbs. We forget about all the other things we need. And remember, protein is absolutely essential. We need it. And you can choose any protein you want. There's a lot of different options out there. So whether it's a piece of meat, some fish, eggs, yogurt, nuts and seeds, there's a lot to choose from when it comes to protein. There's a lot of variation. And so that will fill up roughly a third of your plate. Step number 2 is to choose a fat. So this one is a little bit harder for people because it's been so ingrained into us that we should avoid fat at all costs, particularly if we are trying to lose weight. But I find fat intake extremely important, and sometimes this does take a lot of tweaking to get right because it is really hard for people to increase. And I really like to help people realize that fat is their friend. And just like as I said at the beginning, if you want to burn fat for fuel, you have to put it in your tank. And there are a long list of healthy fats that I give people, so there's a lot of things to choose from. So if you're not ready to just start putting butter on your steak, then you can start with avocado or macadamia nut oil or something like that. So there's a lot of options. And then step number 3 is to control your carbs. So this means different things to different people, and there's different variations for how much carb you're going to add. You may not add any carbohydrate at all to your plate. It's completely up to you. But in general, controlling your carbs means staying away from those really carbohydrate starches and sugars, and then loading up the non-starchy veggies, the low-sugar fruits, and other things like that that you're happy to sort of moderate onto your plate. So, for example, things like milk, yes, it does have lactose in it, which is a carbohydrate. So in that situation, I often give people a maximum portion to have with their meals. But then for other foods like broccoli, there's not a lot of carb in there. So unless someone has a food intolerance, they can really have as much as they want. And then to finish off, just some resources. So places you can go after today to get some more support. The first one is the Low Carb Down Under website. So Low Carb Down Under helped to organise the event today, and they organise so many different great events like this all over Australia. And their website is a really good resource for people who are trying to get started, or even people like practitioners who want to learn more about the science behind low carb. Their YouTube channel has heaps and heaps of free videos, and there's academics, there's practitioners, and there's just the regular person who's done low carb before and is sharing their story. So it's a fantastic resource. And then podcasts. If you haven't gotten into podcasts yet, you should. And the podcasts on the screen are some of the podcasts that I listen to. And I think it's really, really nice to hear people share their experiences, because I think we can learn so much from other people's stories. And that's why I love podcasts, because it's a lot of people just interviewing others, finding out how they do low carb, what they do, why they do it, and I think that can be really, really useful to a lot of us. And then dietitians. I'm not sure if you can see the word dietitians up there, but okay. So I do understand that not all dietitians support low carb, and most of them don't. And I graduated just over 2 years ago, and I know how they teach dietitians at university, and they don't teach you about low carbohydrate diets. And that was really one of the main drivers for my project, my paper that I shared with you, because it really does help people, practitioners, dietitians, formulate low carb diets. But there are a lot of great dietitians out there. I have spoken in a previous talk about the disconnect between what dietitians learn and how some of them practice, and then what we see to be true in the scientific literature for low carb. There is a disconnect, but things are definitely changing, and I think it's really important to find support. So whether it is a dietitian or a health coach, someone who's really savvy in looking at you as a whole person and helping you with the diet you choose to do. Because at the end of the day, it's your choice. And even though I am based in Sydney, we have developed an online program to help people get started with low carb. And if you are interested in learning more about it, you can come meet the Ellipse Health team after the talk or in the break. But it's really just about giving people the support they need and helping people personalize this to them. Because as I said, no two low carb diets should ever really look the same. Everybody is different. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica.